Neutrality to war. FDR and his advisors generally are going to want to support Britain even more so. They're also going to, on some level, want to put some pressure on Japan during this crisis. One thing that FDR is going to end up pushing for and getting is going to be a Lend-Lease program. This would basically allow Great Britain to borrow military equipment for the duration of the war. The idea behind this was they had the inability to actually pay for American goods, so if we just lend them goods, then they don't actually have to pay. The thing is, this Lend-Lease Act is going to trigger a political debate. Now, some were concerned because it basically allowed America to lend anything declared a defense article to Great Britain. And people were concerned that, well, couldn't you declare anything a defense article? And then others were concerned that what if we lent so much to Great Britain that if America got involved, would America still have enough to defend itself? But we do see the measure passes through. And so we're seeing that edging towards involvement on some level. You also have to keep in mind, during this time period, America's basically going to begin an undeclared war in the North Atlantic in regards to our Navy, where basically American ships would report any kind of sighting of German submarine to the British, which very much heavily puts America on the British side. Now, we are going to see an incident during this time period because of this, when the United States destroyer Greer is confronted by a German submarine. FDR is really going to frame this incident as German aggression and then proclaim a shoot-on-sight policy when it comes to German submarines. But quite frankly, the whole Greer incident, the Greer actually shot first at the German submarine. So we're seeing kind of this almost armed neutrality to a certain point. German submarines at that point would, in reply, torpedo the American destroyer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And this means that over 100 American lives will be lost. So America now has been attacked. And I want you kind of to tuck away that information in the back of your head. At this point, Congress is going to repeal part of the Neutrality Act of 1939 and allow basically merchant ships to be armed and carry munitions to Great Britain. So we're seeing a lot more towards that armed neutrality idea. And this is going to bring us to the Atlantic Charter. So FDR and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill are going to meet in secret off of Newfoundland in August of 1941. Basically, when they met, they wanted to map out military strategy and post-war goals. And they're going to do things like, in this meeting, agreed that Germany had to be taken care of before the focus was on Japan. What comes out of this meeting, though, is the proclamation that is known as the Atlantic Charter. Now, this was basically a political umbrella and moral justification for American involvement in the war, even though America has not declared war yet. It was bringing forth ideals like opposing territorial conquest, support of self-government, promotion of freedom of the seas, creating some sort of system of economic collaboration. Clearly, these goals are much more FDR's goals than Churchill's goals. This is when we start seeing some questions about FDR's stance about American involvement in the war. There's this element of historians are still not sure to this day, did FDR want America to join the war, or was he just pushing to help out Great Britain? The only thing we know for sure is a quote that he said to the Secretary of Treasury at this time, and he said, specifically, "I am waiting to be pushed into a situation." Really quick, before I get back to FDR and some questions that we have in regards to him, I wanted to just give you an example of a lot of people's views during this time period and why America shouldn't get involved in the war. So this is Charles Lindbergh. So we talked about him flying the Spirit of St. Louis alone across the Atlantic Ocean and everything. And so he was against American involvement in World War II. And so he says, there are many viewpoints from which the issues of this war can be argued. Some are primarily idealistic. Some are primarily practical. One should, I believe, strive for a balance of both. But since the subjects that can be covered in a single address are limited, tonight I shall discuss the war from a viewpoint which is primarily practical. It is not that I believe ideals are unimportant, even among the realities of war, but if a nation is to survive in a hostile world, its ideals must be backed by the hard logic of military practicability. If the outcome of war depended on ideals alone, this would be a different world than it is today. So all of that first paragraph is looking at, does America have the military strength to back up its ideals? So second paragraph. I know I will be severely criticized by the interventionists in America when I say that we should not enter a war unless we have a reasonable chance of winning. That, they will claim, is far too materialistic a viewpoint. They will advance again the same arguments that were used to persuade France to declare war against Germany in 1939. But I do not believe that our American ideals and our way of life will gain through an unsuccessful war. And I know that the United States is not prepared to wage war in Europe successfully at this time. We are no better prepared to attack. We are no better prepared today than France was when the interventionists in Europe persuaded her to attack the Singford line. So looking at, can America win this war? That was a really big concern for a lot of people who didn't want to intervene. So I ask you, before I get into some more questions and everything, how is America's neutrality like that of World War I? And how is it different? You might want to pause the video, but I'll give you a few seconds to kind of gather your thoughts. So, jumping back to FDR, we have more questions about him than just what was his view on involvement in the war. There is this question of, we've seen now at this point, the attack on the Reuben James that FDR could have used as a reason to attack Germany. What it does seem like, in retrospect, is that we're going to see FDR wants to restrain the Japanese, which I'm going to get a little bit more into the Pacific, with bluff and intimidation, and focus more on defeating Germany. And so what he does during this time period is like move to arm Hawaii by like sending B-17 bombers to the Philippines and such. And so it was supposed to be kind of decisive and firm in the Pacific, while being a lot more aggressive, but even then measured in this aggression in the Atlantic. And so while a lot of the aggression seems to be in the Atlantic, I should point out that FDR and many other officials are expecting some sort of confrontation with Japan, which actually brings to why they're expecting that with Japan. The thing is, the United States during this time period also is going to build up a two-ocean navy, and this is a way that they are antagonizing Japan and basically prodding it into going to war with the United States. Prior to this point, Japan, when you compared their naval strength to the United States, had a ratio of a 7-to-10 strength. So for every 7 Japanese-like ships, America had 10. The problem is, as America starts to get a little bit more and more involved in the war, they're starting to restrict like the imports of steel and iron ore and aluminum and trying to curb military aggression by the Japanese. And so that ratio is not going to stay like that. It's going to become much more pronounced and much larger towards the United States. And so Japan basically made a choice in September of 1942. They basically decided that unless the United States and Britain ended all aid to China and basically acquiesced to the Japanese dominance of Southeast Asia, which I should point out, this was basically impossible terms, then their war preparations would be complete and they will involve America in the war much more directly. That being said, as much as I'm alluding to Pearl Harbor here, the Japanese never planned a full invasion of the United States. They never even planned an extremely divisive victory. More than anything else, Japan wanted to shock the United States into basically letting Japan have their way in Asia by kind of pointing out how much manpower the United States could potentially lose in war with the Japanese. Or, if that didn't shock America, the Japanese were hoping that at least it would win them time to create much more impenetrable defenses across like the Central Pacific. So, America, well, not America, but FDR and many of his officials knew that military action was imminent with the Japanese, partly because they had cracked Japanese codes, but they were expecting it to be predominantly in Southeast Asia. Instead, they're going to be surprised when the Japanese are going to attack the American base on Hawaii. Before dawn, on December 7th of 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers would launch 351 planes and 2 bombing strikes against Pearl Harbor. America will lose 8 battleships, 11 other warships. Nearly all the military aircraft on the base will be damaged or destroyed, and 2,403 people will be killed. However, the dockyards, the dry docks, and the oil storage tanks are going to remain intact, partly because the Japanese admiral is going to refuse to order a third attack. On top of that, many American ships were out at sea on patrol, and they are also going to be unharmed. The thing is, that's not the only attack the Japanese did that day. Within hours, the Japanese will also attack United States bases at Guam, Wake Island, and in the Philippines. FDR will speak of the attack the next day, and he'll say this was a date which will live in infamy. This is going to cause America to declare war against Japan, Germany, and Italy. The next, shortly after, they declare war against the United States in return. Also, I should point out, on January 1st of 1942, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, as well as 23 other nations, are going to subscribe to the principles of the Atlantic Charter. They're going to pledge not to negotiate a separate peace. So we're not going to see that whole issue with the Tsarist Russia and Germany back from like World War I and everything.